The morning mist clung to the brick pathways of Columbia University like memories that refused to fade. Warren Buffett, now 87 years old, stepped out of his modest rental car. Not the luxury vehicle one might expect from the world's most successful investor, but a simple sedan that had served him well for years. His weathered hands gripped a worn leather briefcase, the same one he had carried for decades, containing not financial documents or stock certificates, but something far more precious, a handwritten letter that had arrived at his Omaha office 3 weeks prior. The letter was from someone he hadn't heard from in over 60 years, yet the name had stirred something deep within his chest, a mixture of regret, curiosity, and an old wound that had never quite healed. Thomas Mitchell. The boy who had sat alone in the back of their finance class in 1951, the one who had been ridiculed for carrying around a copy of The Intelligent Investor when everyone else was focused on fraternity parties and football games. As Warren walked through the familiar campus grounds, his mind drifted back to those days when he was young, eager, and perhaps a little too confident in his theories about value investing. He remembered Professor Graham's classroom, the way sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny stock prices fluctuating on an invisible exchange. Most of all, he remembered Thomas, quiet, thoughtful Thomas, who asked questions that revealed a depth of understanding that most of their classmates couldn't grasp. Warren had been the star student then, the one everyone knew would make it big. Thomas had been the outsider, the scholarship kid from a small farming town in Nebraska, wearing clothes that had been mended too many times and carrying textbooks held together with tape. While Warren enjoyed the respect of his peers and professors, Thomas endured their mockery. "Look at Mitchell," they would whisper, "reading about investing when he can't even afford a decent meal." The irony wasn't lost on Warren now as he approached the building where it had all begun. The letter in his briefcase had contained an invitation, not to a reunion, not to a celebration, but to something far more significant. Thomas Mitchell, the boy they had all dismissed, had just donated $50 million to Columbia University's business school. The quiet kid from Nebraska had become one of the most successful venture capitalists on the West Coast, and Warren had never known. Warren paused at the entrance to the business building, his reflection caught in the glass doors. The years had etched lines around his eyes, but they sparkled with the same curiosity that had driven him as a young man. He thought about the letter again, about Thomas's words. "Mr. Buffett, I hope you can find time to attend the dedication ceremony. You probably don't remember me, but you changed my life in ways you'll never know. I'd like to tell you how." But Warren did remember. He remembered everything. The ceremony wasn't scheduled to begin for another hour, but Warren had arrived early, as was his habit. He preferred quiet moments before big events, time to observe and reflect. As he entered the building, he was struck by how little had changed. The same marble floors, the same high ceilings, the same sense of academic gravitas that had inspired him all those years ago. He made his way to Professor Graham's old classroom, now updated with modern technology, but still retaining its essential character. The morning light still streamed through those same tall windows, and Warren found himself transported back to 1951, when he was 21 years old and thought he had all the answers. It was during their second week of classes that Warren had first really noticed Thomas Mitchell. The young man sat in the back corner, always taking meticulous notes, always prepared with thoughtful questions. While other students struggled with Graham's concepts of intrinsic value and margin of safety, Thomas seemed to grasp them intuitively. "Mr. Mitchell," Professor Graham had said one particularly memorable morning, "what's your take on the railroad stocks we discussed yesterday?" Thomas had stood slowly, his voice soft but confident. "Well, sir, If we look beyond the current market, pessimism about rail transport. These companies own vast amounts of real estate and infrastructure that's being valued at a fraction of its replacement cost. The market is pricing in permanent decline, but I think that's overly pessimistic. Transportation needs will always exist, and these companies have irreplaceable assets. The analysis was brilliant, and Warren had felt a twinge of competitive admiration. Here was someone who understood value investing at a level that rivaled his own understanding. But instead of reaching out, instead of befriending Thomas, Warren had remained focused on his own circle of friends, his own path to success. The mockery had started innocently enough. Thomas carried The Intelligent Investor everywhere, reading it during lunch, referencing it in conversations, treating it like a sacred text. His devotion to Graham's principles was absolute, and in the social environment of 1950s Columbia, such intensity about investing theory was seen as oddly obsessive. "There goes Bible Mitchell," Warren remembered hearing someone say as Thomas walked past, book in hand. The nickname stuck, and soon Thomas became known as the guy who was too serious about money for someone who clearly didn't have any. Warren had never participated in the teasing directly, but he hadn't stopped it either. He had been too focused on his own success, too comfortable in his position as Graham's favored student. It was a failure of character that had bothered him for decades, though he rarely admitted it to himself. The sound of footsteps in the hallway brought Warren back to the present. He turned to see a distinguished man in his late 80s approaching, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world with both wisdom and caution. The man's face was lined but kind, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit impeccably tailored but understated. "Warren," the man said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone Warren remembered from 6 decades ago. "Thomas." Warren stood, extending his hand, but Thomas moved past it and embraced him warmly. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Thomas said, stepping back but keeping his hands on Warren's shoulders. "When I sent that letter, I thought maybe you wouldn't remember, or maybe you'd be too busy." "I remember everything," Warren said quietly, "and I'm never too busy for something that matters." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 old men surrounded by the ghosts of their younger selves. The classroom around them seemed to shimmer with memories. Late afternoon discussions about market efficiency, early morning study sessions, the electric atmosphere of learning from one of the greatest investment minds of the 20th century. "You want to know something funny?" Thomas said, settling into one of the student desks, his long frame folding awkwardly into the small space. "I still have that copy of The Intelligent Investor, the one everyone made fun of me for carrying. Around. It's sitting on my desk at home, held together with tape and good intentions." Warren smiled, taking a seat nearby. "And what does it say about the railroad stocks you analyzed in class that day?" "That I was right, eventually." Thomas's eyes twinkled with quiet satisfaction. "Bought shares in 3 different rail companies after graduation. Held them for 30 years. They funded my first real estate venture, which led to my technology investments, which led to..." He gestured around the room. "Well, to this. $50 million is a significant donation," Warren observed. "The university must be thrilled." "Money's just a tool," Thomas replied, echoing something Graham had often said. "The question is what you build with it." Warren nodded, understanding completely. Throughout his own career, he had tried to use his wealth as a force for good, but he had always been strategic about it, calculated. Thomas's donation felt different, more personal, more emotional. "Can I ask you something?" Warren said, "Why Columbia? Why now?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the old wooden desk. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of careful consideration. "Do you remember Jenny Rodriguez?" he asked finally. Warren searched his memory, but the name didn't immediately surface. Thomas seemed to sense his confusion. She was a few years behind us, scholarship student like me. Brilliant mind for economics, but she was struggling. Working 3 jobs to pay for school, sleeping in the library because she couldn't afford a decent place to live. The other students, they weren't kind to her either. Warren felt a familiar pang of discomfort. The social dynamics of their era hadn't been forgiving to those who didn't fit the traditional mold. I tried to help her when I could, Thomas continued. Shared my notes, bought her lunch when she'd let me, helped her find a part-time job that paid better than the ones she was juggling. But it wasn't enough. She dropped out after her sophomore year, said she couldn't handle the financial pressure. And the social isolation, what happened to her? She became a teacher, elementary school in the Bronx, spent 40 years educating kids who reminded her of herself. Smart, determined, but without advantages. She never married, never had children of her own, but she touched thousands of lives, changed thousands of futures. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Warren a photograph. An elderly Latina woman surrounded by dozens of children, all beaming at the camera. The woman's eyes held the same intelligent spark that Warren imagined had impressed her professors. All those years ago, she died last year, Thomas said softly. Cancer. I went to her funeral. There must have been 500 people there. Former students, parents, other teachers. They all had stories about how Jenny had believed in them when no one else did. How she had pushed them to achieve more than they thought possible. Warren studied the photograph, seeing in the woman's face the echo of countless students he had known over the years. Bright, eager, but faced with obstacles that had nothing to do with their intelligence or potential. At the service, Thomas continued, her nephew spoke about a recurring dream she'd had. She dreamed about going back to finish her degree, about becoming an economist, about using her knowledge to help families like hers build wealth and security. She never stopped regretting that she had to leave Columbia. The pieces began to fall into place for Warren. The donation is for her. The donation is for every Jenny Rodriguez who walks through these doors, Thomas confirmed. Every brilliant kid who gets mocked for caring too much about learning. Every scholarship student who feels like they don't belong. Every dreamer who gets told they're reaching too high. Warren felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of his own complicity in the very dynamics Thomas was working to change. He thought about all the times he had remained silent when he could have spoken up, all the opportunities he had missed to extend a hand to someone who needed it. There's something else, Thomas said, his voice becoming even quieter. Something I've wanted to tell you for 60 years. Warren waited, sensing that whatever Thomas was about to share would be significant. That day in class, when I gave my analysis of the railroad stocks, do you remember what happened afterward? Warren tried to recall the specific details, but they were fuzzy. Professor Graham praised your insight, I think. He did. But what you might not remember is that after class, you walked past me in the hallway. I was gathering my books, including that worn copy of Graham's book that everyone made fun of. You stopped, looked at the book, and then looked at me. Warren held his breath, afraid of what was coming next. You said, Mitchell, that was a brilliant analysis. You understand value, better than most professionals I know. And then you walked away. The memory came flooding back to Warren, a brief moment of genuine admiration that he had almost immediately forgotten in the rush of his own ambitions. But for Thomas, clearly, it had been pivotal. You have no idea what those words meant. To me, Thomas continued, I was ready to quit school that week. The financial pressure was overwhelming, and the social isolation was eating away at my confidence. I'd started to believe what everyone was saying, that I was just a farm kid playing in a league too advanced for me. Warren felt a lump forming in his throat. But when Warren Buffett, the Warren Buffett, Graham's star pupil, told me, I understood value. It changed everything. I realized that maybe the problem wasn't my intelligence or my potential. Maybe the problem was that I was surrounded by people who couldn't see past the surface. Thomas, you saved my academic career with one sentence. Thomas interrupted gently. You probably said similar things to dozens of students and forgot about them immediately. But for me, that moment of recognition from someone I respected gave me the strength to keep going. Warren was quiet for a long time, processing the weight of Thomas's revelation. He thought about all the casual interactions he'd had over the years, all the brief comments and passing observations that he'd made without considering their potential impact. How many lives had been shaped by moments he couldn't even remember? The donation, Warren said finally, it's not just about helping students. It's about creating a culture where recognition and encouragement are valued as much as competition and achievement. Exactly. Thomas smiled, and Warren could see in that smile the echo of the young man who had sat in the back of Graham's classroom, hungry for knowledge and acceptance in equal measure. They were interrupted by the sound of voices in the hallway. University. Officials and donors arriving for the dedication ceremony, but Warren wasn't ready to let the moment end. Thomas, can I ask you about your investment career? How did you go from railroad stocks to venture capital? Thomas chuckled. That's a longer story, but since we have a few more minutes. Thomas settled back in his chair, and Warren could see him organizing his thoughts in the same methodical way he had approached problems in graduate school. After graduation, I moved back to Nebraska, not far from your hometown, actually. I took a job at a small regional bank, analyzing loan applications and investment opportunities. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave me a front-row seat to how real businesses operated, how entrepreneurs thought, how communities grew and changed. Warren nodded, understanding the value of that kind of ground-level experience. I spent 5 years at that bank, learning everything I could about different industries and business models, but I also started investing my own money, small amounts at first, following Graham's principles religiously. The railroad stocks were just the beginning. I looked for companies that were fundamentally sound but temporarily undervalued. What was your first big success? A small manufacturing company in Iowa that made agricultural equipment. The farming crisis of the late 1950s had everyone convinced that agricultural businesses were doomed, so the stock was trading at a fraction of book value. But I knew farming. I'd grown up on a farm, remember? I understood that the crisis was cyclical, not permanent. Warren smiled. You had an informational advantage. Exactly. And that's when I realized that successful investing isn't just about applying formulas or following rules. It's about understanding the world around you, paying attention to what others are overlooking, and having the courage to act on your convictions. When did you make the transition to technology? Early 1970s. I was living in California by then, working for a small investment firm. Silicon Valley was just starting to emerge as a technology center, and I was fascinated by these young entrepreneurs who were trying to build companies around ideas that seemed impossible. Most investors stayed away because they couldn't understand the technology, but I saw something different. Thomas paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the classroom walls. I saw the same hunger I'd felt as a student, that drive to prove that unconventional thinking could lead to extraordinary results. These entrepreneurs reminded me of myself at Columbia, carrying around ideas that other people thought were strange or impractical. So you started investing in technology. Companies? I started investing in people, Thomas corrected. Companies can fail, technologies can become obsolete, but people with vision and determination find ways to create value regardless of the specific vehicle. I looked for entrepreneurs who combined technical brilliance with business sense, who understood that innovation without market understanding is just expensive experimentation. Warren was impressed by the sophistication of Thomas's approach. It was a natural evolution of Graham's value investing principles, adapted for a different era and a different type of opportunity. My first major technology investment was in a small company that was developing software for managing inventory in retail stores. Everyone thought it was too niche, too limited. But I could see that as computers became more common, inventory management would become increasingly important for businesses of all sizes. How did that work out? The company was acquired by IBM 5 years later for 20 times what I had invested. But more importantly, the experience taught me to look for technologies that solved real problems for real businesses, not just technologies that were intellectually interesting. As Thomas spoke, Warren began to understand the trajectory that had led from that quiet student in Graham's classroom to one of the most successful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. It wasn't just about applying investment principles, it was about understanding human nature, market dynamics, and the intersection of innovation and practicality. Over the next 2 decades, Thomas continued, I invested in dozens of technology companies. Some failed spectacularly, but the successes more than made up for the failures. I learned to diversify not just across companies, but across stages of development, types of technology, and market segments. And you never forgot the lessons from Columbia? Never. Every time I met with an entrepreneur, I thought about what it felt like to be dismissed because of surface-level judgments. I tried to look past the stereotypes, the college dropout, the immigrant with broken English, the woman in a male-dominated industry, and focus on the substance of their ideas and their character. Warren felt a deep respect for the path Thomas had chosen. While Warren had built his wealth through public markets and established companies, Thomas had taken the riskier but potentially more transformative route of supporting innovation at its earliest stages. The funny thing is, Thomas added with a wry smile, many of the entrepreneurs I invested in were a lot like I was in school. Outsiders with unconventional ideas, facing skepticism from established players. Helping them succeed felt like completing a circle that started in Graham's classroom. The voices in the hallway were getting closer, and Warren knew their private conversation would soon be interrupted. But there was one more question he needed to ask. Thomas, why didn't you reach out sooner? We've been working in related fields for 60 years. We could have collaborated, shared insights, learned from each other. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Warren could see him considering how to answer honestly without causing offense. Pride, partly, Thomas said finally. After graduation, I wanted to prove that I could succeed on my own terms without relying on connections or associations with more famous names. I spent so many years feeling like an outsider that independence became almost an obsession. Warren understood that motivation completely. He had felt similar drives in his own career, though his circumstances had been more favorable. But there was something else, Thomas continued. I wasn't sure you'd remember me, or if you did, whether you'd remember me fondly. Our social circles at Columbia didn't really overlap, and I wasn't sure if you'd seen me as a peer or just as another student. The honesty of the admission stung Warren, not because it was unfair, but because it was probably accurate. He'd been so focused on his own trajectory that he hadn't invested much effort in building relationships with classmates who weren't in his immediate social circle. That's one of my great regrets, Warren said quietly. I missed the opportunity to know you better when we were young, and I missed decades of friendship and collaboration because I didn't make the effort to stay connected. We're here now, Thomas replied simply. That's what matters. The classroom door opened and a university official appeared, a middle-aged woman in professional attire who clearly recognized both men immediately. Mr. Buffett, Mr. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, the current dean of the business school. We're so honored to have you both here today. Warren and Thomas stood, their moment of private reflection coming to an end. But as they prepared to join the larger ceremony, Warren felt a sense of completion that he hadn't expected. The conversation with Thomas had illuminated not just the path his old classmate had taken, but also some of the choices and missed opportunities in his own life. "Before we go," Warren said to Thomas, "I want you to know that your story, your success, your generosity, your commitment to helping others, it's inspiring in ways you might not realize. You've shown me that there are many different ways to create value in the world." Thomas smiled, the same thoughtful expression he had worn as a young man. "And you've shown millions of people that principled investing can create not just wealth, but trust and stability. We've taken different paths, but we've both tried to honor what Professor Graham taught us." As they followed Dr. Chen out of the classroom and toward the ceremony, Warren reflected on the unexpected gift of this reunion. He had come to Columbia expecting a routine dedication ceremony, but he was leaving with something far more valuable: a renewed understanding of the ripple effects of kindness, the power of recognition, and the importance of using success to lift others. The dedication ceremony took place in the university's main auditorium, a grand space that had hosted countless academic events over the decades. Warren sat in the front row listening as Dr. Chen introduced Thomas to an audience of faculty, students, donors, and university administrators. "Thomas Mitchell," Dr. Chen said, "represents the very best of what Columbia Business School strives to develop. Not just successful professionals, but thoughtful leaders who understand that true achievement means using your talents and resources to benefit others." As Thomas approached the podium, Warren was struck by how comfortable he seemed in front of the audience. This wasn't the shy, uncertain young man from their graduate school days, but someone who had grown into his own authority and wisdom. "Thank you, Dr. Chen, and thank you all for being here today," Thomas began, his voice carrying easily through the auditorium. "I want to start by acknowledging someone very special who's here with us. My former classmate, Warren Buffett, who taught me more about investing than he'll ever know." Warren felt a flush of embarrassment and gratitude as the audience turned to look at him. He had expected to be anonymous at this event, but Thomas's acknowledgement felt genuine and generous. 60 years ago," Thomas continued, "I sat in Professor Benjamin Graham's classroom, surrounded by some of the brightest minds of my generation. I was intimidated, frankly. I came from a small farming community in Nebraska, and I often felt like I didn't belong in such distinguished company." Warren could see some of the current students in the audience nodding in recognition. The imposter syndrome that Thomas described was timeless and universal. But this university and the professors and classmates I encountered here taught me something invaluable: that intellectual curiosity and ethical principles matter more than background or social connections. They taught me that asking good questions is more important than having all the answers, and that real success means creating value for others, not just for yourself. Thomas paused, and Warren could see him organizing his thoughts for what was clearly the heart of his speech. "The donation I'm making today, $50 million to establish the Mitchell Fellowship Program, isn't really about money. It's about opportunity. It's about ensuring that brilliant young minds, regardless of their economic circumstances, can access the education and mentorship they need to reach their full potential." The audience erupted in applause, but Thomas held up his hand to continue. "But more than that, this program is about creating a culture of inclusion and mutual support. Every Mitchell Fellow will be paired not just with a faculty mentor, but with successful alumni who commit to providing ongoing guidance and support. We're creating a network of people who understand that lifting others up is the most reliable way to elevate our entire profession." Warren felt a deep admiration for the comprehensiveness of Thomas's vision. This wasn't just charity, it was systematic change designed to address the root causes of the problems Thomas had experienced as a student. "I want to tell you about someone who inspired this program," Thomas continued, and Warren knew he was about to hear about Jenny Rodriguez again. Her name was Jenny Rodriguez, and she was a student here in the 1950s. She was brilliant, dedicated, and passionate about economics. But she was also working 3 jobs to pay for school, and she faced social obstacles that had nothing to do with her academic abilities. Thomas's voice became more personal, more emotional. Jenny eventually had to leave Columbia before completing her degree. She went on to become an elementary school teacher in the Bronx, where she spent 40 years inspiring children who faced challenges similar to her own. She never forgot her dream of completing her economics education, and she never stopped believing that financial literacy and economic opportunity could transform lives. Warren watched the faces in the audience as Thomas spoke about Jenny. He could see recognition, empathy, and determination in their expressions. Thomas was making Jenny's story universal, helping everyone understand that talent and potential exist everywhere, but opportunity doesn't. The Mitchell Fellowship Program will ensure that future Jenny Rodriguez's don't have to choose between their dreams and their survival. But it will also do something else. It will teach all of our students that their success is connected to the success of others, that the highest form of achievement is empowering someone else to reach their potential. As Thomas continued his speech, outlining the details of the fellowship program and his vision for its impact, Warren found himself thinking about his own legacy. He had given away billions of dollars through the Giving Pledge and various charitable initiatives, but most of his philanthropy focused on large-scale problems: global health, education systems, poverty alleviation. Thomas's approach was more personal, more focused on individual transformation within a specific community. Neither approach was better than the other, Warren realized, but together they represented different aspects of responsible wealth management. His own giving addressed systemic issues that affected millions of people. Thomas's giving addressed the human dynamics that determined whether individual potential could be realized. When Thomas finished his speech, he received a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Warren joined enthusiastically, moved not just by his old classmates' generosity, but by the thoughtfulness and personal commitment behind it. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the business school's main lobby. Warren found himself surrounded by faculty members and current students, all eager to discuss investment philosophy and economic theory. He enjoyed these conversations, but he kept one eye on Thomas, who was engaged in similar discussions across the room. Eventually, Warren excused himself from his admirers and made his way to Thomas's side. The two men stood together, watching the animated conversations happening around them. "Reminds me of our student days," Thomas observed. "Same energy, same curiosity, same confidence that they can change the world." "And they probably can," Warren replied. "Each generation builds on what came before, pushes further, sees possibilities that weren't visible to us. That's what I'm counting on with the fellowship program. These students will do things with their opportunities that I can't even imagine." A young woman approached them, a current MBA student with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to academic success, but also the slightly uncertain expression of someone meeting legendary figures for the first time. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Maria Santos, a second-year student. I just wanted to thank you both for being here today and Mr. Mitchell for creating this opportunity for future students." "What's your area of focus, Maria?" Thomas asked with genuine interest. "Impact. Investing, actually. I'm trying to figure out how to direct capital toward companies that can generate both financial returns and positive social outcomes." It's challenging because the metrics for measuring social impact are still pretty primitive. Warren and Thomas exchanged a glance, both recognizing in Maria the same passionate intensity they had brought to their own studies decades earlier. "That's fascinating work," Warren said. "What's your take on the trade-offs between financial returns and social impact? Do you see them as inherently in tension or potentially complementary?" Maria's eyes lit up at the question. "I think they can be complementary, but it requires a longer time horizon and a more sophisticated understanding of value creation. Companies that treat their employees well, minimize environmental impact, and serve underserved markets often outperform over the long term, but the benefits might not show up in quarterly earnings." "That's a very mature perspective," Thomas noted. "Have you had opportunities to put these ideas into practice?" "I'm working on a project analyzing microfinance institutions in Latin America, trying to understand which organizational models produce the best outcomes for both lenders and borrowers. The preliminary results suggest that the most successful programs focus on financial education and community building, not just access to capital." Warren was impressed by the sophistication of Maria's thinking. She was grappling with complex issues that he and Thomas had approached from different angles throughout their careers. "Maria," Thomas said, "would you be interested in staying in touch? I'd love to hear more about your research as it develops, and I might be able to connect you with some practitioners who are working on similar problems." "That would be incredible," Maria replied, her professional composure giving way to genuine excitement. As they exchanged contact information, Warren reflected on what he was witnessing. This was the Mitchell Fellowship Program in action, even before it was officially launched. Successful alumni taking personal interest in current students, creating connections that would extend far beyond graduation, building networks based on shared values rather than just shared experiences. The conversation with Maria continued for another 20 minutes, ranging across topics from development economics to behavioral finance to the role of technology in financial inclusion. Warren found himself learning as much as he was contributing, reminded once again that wisdom often emerged from the intersection of different perspectives and experiences. As the reception began to wind down, Warren and Thomas found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the lobby. The energy of the event had been invigorating, but both men seemed ready for a more reflective conversation. "That young woman reminds me of us at that age," Thomas said, "convinced that we could solve the world's problems through smart analysis and good intentions." "Maybe we were right," Warren replied. "Maybe the problems just turned out to be more complex than we realized. Or maybe each generation has to solve the problems that their predecessors couldn't quite finish," Thomas suggested. "We figured out how to build wealth systematically and ethically. Maria's generation is figuring out how to ensure that wealth creation serves broader social purposes." Warren nodded, appreciating the continuity that Thomas was describing. "It's like intellectual evolution. Each generation builds on what came before, but adapts to new circumstances and challenges." "Speaking of evolution," Thomas said, "I have a confession to make. When I was developing the fellowship program, I studied your approach to philanthropy pretty carefully. The Giving Pledge, your partnership with Gates and Munger, your focus on addressing root causes rather than just symptoms." Warren was surprised, but pleased. "I had no idea you were paying attention to my charitable work." "Of course I was. You've been a pioneer in strategic philanthropy, just like you were a pioneer in value investing. I learned from your example, even if I applied the lessons in a different context." "What did you learn?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "That effective giving requires the same analytical rigor as effective investing. You have to understand the problems you're trying to solve, measure the impact of your interventions, and be willing to adjust your approach based on results. You can't just write checks and hope for the best. That's exactly right. And like investing, effective philanthropy often requires patience. The most important changes happen slowly, over decades, rather than quarters. Which brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you, Thomas said, his tone becoming more serious. The Mitchell Fellowship Program is designed to be permanent, but I won't be around forever to guide its evolution. I'm looking for board members who share the program's values and have the expertise to ensure it remains effective. Warren immediately understood what Thomas was asking. You want me to help oversee the program? I want you to help shape its future. Your experience with large-scale philanthropy, combined with your understanding of financial markets and business education, would be invaluable. And frankly, having Warren Buffett associated with the program would open doors and attract resources that I couldn't access on my own. Warren was honored by the request, but he also felt the weight of the responsibility Thomas was describing. Committing to oversee the fellowship program would mean committing to Columbia University, to current and future students, and to the vision of inclusive excellence that Thomas had articulated. I'd be honored to help, Warren said finally. But I want to understand your vision more completely before I make specific commitments. Fair enough. Why don't you come out to California next month? I can show you some of the companies I've invested in, introduce you to some of the entrepreneurs I've worked with, and we can spend some time thinking through how the fellowship program might evolve over time. I'd like that very much. They shook hands on the agreement, but Warren felt like they were also shaking hands on something larger. A partnership that would extend their influence beyond their individual achievements, a collaboration that honored both their shared past and their hopes for the future. As they prepared to leave the reception, Dr. Chen approached them one final time. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for making today so special. Mr. Mitchell, your donation and your vision for the fellowship program will transform this institution. And Mr. Buffett, your presence here and your willingness to support Thomas's initiative means more than you know. It's been my privilege, Warren replied. This is exactly the kind of program that business schools should be pioneering. Dr. Chen, Thomas added, I hope you'll keep us informed about the program's development. Warren and I are both committed to its success, and we want to be helpful however we can. You can count on it, Dr. Chen assured them. As Warren and Thomas walked out of the business school together, Warren felt a sense of closure and beginning that he hadn't expected when he'd received Thomas's letter 3 weeks earlier. The day had been about more than a donation ceremony. It had been about reconnecting with values and relationships that had shaped both of their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Thomas, Warren said as they reached the campus parking area, I want you to know that today has been one of the most meaningful experiences I've had in years. Reconnecting with you, hearing your story, seeing your vision for the fellowship program, it's reminded me why I fell in love with investing and education in the first place. For me too, Thomas replied. I've spent decades building wealth and trying to use it responsibly, but I've often felt isolated from the community of people who share those values. Today reminded me that collaboration and friendship can amplify individual efforts in ways that go far beyond simple addition. They embraced again, and Warren was struck by how natural the gesture felt. Despite the decades they had spent apart, despite the different paths their careers had taken, there was still a fundamental connection between them, a shared appreciation for learning, for principled decision-making, and for the responsibility that comes with success. I'll call you next week to set up that California visit, Warren said as they prepared to part ways. I'm looking forward to it. And Warren, thank you for remembering that 21-year-old kid who was trying so hard to understand what Professor Graham was teaching us. Thank you for becoming the man that kid was meant to be. As Warren drove away from Columbia University, his mind was full of reflections on the day's events, but also on the larger patterns they revealed about success, legacy, and human connection. The highway stretched ahead of him, familiar and comforting, but his thoughts were far from the mundane details of navigation. He thought about the letter that had started this journey. Thomas's careful words about wanting to share how Warren had changed his life. At the time, Warren had assumed it was a polite exaggeration, the kind of thing successful people said when they reconnected with figures from their past. Now, he understood that Thomas had been entirely literal. A single moment of recognition, barely remembered by the person who offered it, had altered the trajectory of another person's entire life. The weight of that realization was both humbling and energizing. Warren had always believed that actions had consequences, but he had focused primarily on the obvious, measurable outcomes: investment returns, business performance, philanthropic impact. He had paid less attention to the subtle ways that casual interactions could ripple outward through time, shaping decisions and possibilities in ways that might not become visible for decades. As he drove through the afternoon traffic, Warren found himself thinking about other brief encounters from his past. How many times had he offered casual encouragement or recognition without considering its potential impact? How many times had he failed to offer such recognition when it might have mattered? The questions were impossible to answer, but they opened up new ways of thinking about responsibility and influence. His phone rang, interrupting his reverie. The caller ID showed his assistant's number, and Warren reluctantly answered, knowing that the practical demands of his life would soon reassert themselves. "Warren, I hope the event went well," his assistant said. "I have a few messages that probably need your attention before tomorrow's board meeting." "The event was remarkable," Warren replied. "Actually, more than remarkable. It was transformative." "That's wonderful to hear. Are you ready for me to go through the messages?" "Actually, can you do me a favor first? I need you to research someone for me. Thomas Mitchell, venture capitalist, probably based in California. I want to understand his investment philosophy and his portfolio companies. Also, see if you can find any published interviews or articles where he discusses his approach to working with entrepreneurs. Of course, is this for a potential investment or partnership?" Warren considered how to answer. The truth was that he wasn't entirely sure what his renewed relationship with Thomas might lead to, but he sensed it would be significant. "It's for a friendship," he said finally. "Sometimes the most important partnerships don't fit into traditional business categories." After handling the most urgent messages, Warren found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Maria Santos, the student interested in impact investing. Her questions about the relationship between financial returns and social outcomes had been sophisticated, but they had also reminded him of his own early struggles to understand how market mechanisms could serve broader human purposes. When Warren had first started investing seriously, the field was much more compartmentalized than it was today. You either pursued maximum financial returns or you pursued social good, but the idea that you could systematically achieve both was considered naive or idealistic. Thomas's career had demonstrated that this false dichotomy was based on limited thinking rather than fundamental constraints. Warren's own approach had evolved over the decades, moving from pure value investing toward a more nuanced understanding of how business performance, social responsibility, and long-term value creation were interconnected. Companies that treated stakeholders well, operated ethically, and contributed positively to their communities tended to outperform over time, not despite their values, but because of them. But Thomas had taken this insight a step further, actively seeking out entrepreneurs whose business models were designed to create positive social outcomes. Instead of screening for social responsibility after identifying attractive investments, Thomas had made positive impact a primary criterion for investment selection. It was a more integrated approach and potentially a more effective one. As Warren pulled into his driveway in Omaha, he realized that his conversation with Thomas had crystallized some ideas that had been developing in his mind for months. He had been thinking about how to make his own philanthropic efforts more personal and more directly connected to individual human potential. The Mitchell Fellowship Program offered a model for how strategic giving could combine systematic impact with personal relationships. That evening, Warren sat in his home office, surrounded by the familiar artifacts of a long and successful career: awards, photographs, books that had shaped his thinking, letters from grateful shareholders and beneficiaries of his charitable work. But his attention was focused on a legal pad where he was sketching out ideas for his own educational initiative. What if he created a program similar to Thomas's fellowship, but focused on high school students from small towns across the Midwest? Warren had always believed that some of the smartest, most determined people in America lived in communities that were overlooked by elite institutions. These students often had the intellectual capacity to succeed at top universities, but lacked the social capital and financial resources to access those opportunities. Warren's program could identify promising students in their junior year of high school, provide them with mentorship and financial support through their senior year, and then facilitate their transition to college with full scholarships and ongoing guidance. But like Thomas's program, it would be about more than money. It would be about creating a network of support that would follow these students throughout their careers. The more Warren thought about the idea, the more excited he became. He could leverage his relationships with university presidents, business leaders, and other philanthropists to create opportunities that would be impossible for individual students to access on their own. And by focusing on students from small towns and rural areas, he could address a form of geographic inequality that received less attention than other forms of social stratification. Warren worked on his notes until well past midnight, energized by the possibility of creating something that would honor both his own small-town origins and Thomas's example of transformative generosity. But as he finally prepared for bed, he realized that the program he was envisioning would be most effective if it were developed in collaboration with Thomas rather than in isolation. The next morning, Warren called Thomas before his usual breakfast routine. "Warren, this is a pleasant surprise," Thomas said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I hope you're not calling to tell me you've changed your mind about visiting California." "Actually, I'm calling because I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. Your fellowship program has inspired me to think about similar initiatives, and I'd like to explore whether we might collaborate on something. I'm intrigued. What do you have in mind?" Warren outlined his idea for a program focused on high school students from small towns, explaining how it could complement the Mitchell Fellowship Program by creating a pipeline of students who would be prepared to take advantage of opportunities at elite universities. Thomas listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about implementation details and potential challenges. By the end of the conversation, they had agreed to spend their upcoming California meeting developing a joint proposal for what they were calling the Rural Excellence Initiative. "You know what's interesting about this?" Thomas said as their call was winding down. 60 years ago, we were both small-town kids trying to prove we belonged at Columbia. Now, we're in a position to make sure future generations of small-town kids don't have to prove anything. They'll know they belong because we'll have shown them they do. That's exactly right, Warren agreed. We're completing a circle that started when we were their age. Over the following weeks, Warren threw himself into research and planning for the Rural Excellence Initiative with the same intensity he had once brought to analyzing undervalued stocks. He reached out to high school principals in small towns across Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri, asking about their most promising students and the obstacles those students faced in pursuing higher education. The conversations were both inspiring and sobering. Warren spoke with principals who described brilliant students working part-time jobs to help support their families, talented athletes who couldn't afford the training and travel required to earn college scholarships, and academically gifted teenagers who had never considered applying to elite universities because such opportunities seemed impossibly remote from their daily reality. But Warren also heard stories of resilience, determination, and community support that reminded him why he had always believed in the potential of people from small towns. These students weren't disadvantaged in terms of character or capability. They were disadvantaged in terms of access and opportunity. The Rural Excellence Initiative could change that equation fundamentally. 3 weeks after the Columbia ceremony, Warren flew to San Francisco to visit Thomas. The reunion had been emotional and meaningful, but this trip was about translating emotion into action, about moving from reconnection to collaboration. Thomas met Warren at the airport personally, driving a comfortable but understated sedan that reflected the same values Warren had observed at Columbia. Success without ostentation, achievement grounded in substance rather than image. "Welcome to California," Thomas said as they navigated the airport traffic. "I have to warn you, I've packed our schedule pretty full. I want to show you some of the companies I've invested in, introduce you to some entrepreneurs, and give you a sense of how venture capital works when it's driven by values as much as returns." "I'm looking forward to all of it," Warren replied. "But I'm most interested in understanding how you evaluate people, how you identify entrepreneurs who have both the vision to create innovative companies and the character to build sustainable businesses." "That's the heart of everything," Thomas agreed. "Technology and market opportunities come and go, but people are what make the difference between success and failure." Their first stop was a software company in Palo Alto that had developed a platform for managing supply chains in developing countries. The CEO was a woman in her early 30s who had grown up in rural Kenya and had experienced firsthand the inefficiencies that the platform was designed to address. "Sarah," Thomas said as he introduced Warren to the CEO, "has built something remarkable here. Her company doesn't just optimize supply chains. It creates economic opportunities for small farmers and local businesses who were previously excluded from global markets." As Sarah walked them through her company's operations, Warren was struck by the sophistication of both the technology and the business model. The platform used artificial intelligence and mobile communications to connect small-scale producers with buyers, while also providing access to financing, logistics support, and market information. "The key insight," Sarah explained, was that the problems faced by small producers in developing countries aren't just about access to markets. They're about access to information, financing, and reliable partners. Our platform addresses all of these issues simultaneously. Warren asked about the company's financial performance, and Sarah's answers revealed a business that was both profitable and rapidly growing. But what impressed him most was her focus on measuring social impact alongside financial returns. The B company tracked metrics like the number of small producers using the platform, the average increase in income for those producers, and the environmental benefits of more efficient supply chains. This is exactly what Maria Santos was talking about at Columbia. Warren said to Thomas as they left the company's offices. She was trying to understand how to measure social impact, and Sarah has actually figured out how to do it systematically. That's why I invested in her company, Thomas replied. Sarah understands that creating positive social outcomes isn't separate from creating business value. It's the foundation of business value. Companies that genuinely solve important problems for underserved populations can build competitive advantages that are almost impossible to replicate. Their next stop was a biotechnology company that was developing affordable diagnostic tests for diseases that primarily affected people in low-income countries. The founder was a former academic researcher who had left his tenured position to commercialize discoveries that pharmaceutical companies had been reluctant to pursue because of limited profit potential. The irony, the founder explained to Warren, is that these diseases affect millions of people, but because those people can't afford expensive treatments, the market is considered too small to be attractive. We've figured out how to develop effective diagnostics at price points that work for resource-constrained healthcare systems. Warren was fascinated by the business model, which relied on high-volume, low-margin sales rather than the high-margin approach typical of pharmaceutical companies. It was a classic example of how changing assumptions about pricing and distribution could unlock market opportunities that traditional approaches missed. How did you convince investors to support such an unconventional approach? Warren asked. Thomas was actually my first investor, the founder replied. Most VCs wanted me to focus on diseases that affected wealthier populations. But Thomas understood that serving underserved markets could be both profitable and scalable if you approached it correctly. As they toured the company's laboratories and manufacturing facilities, Warren gained a deeper appreciation for Thomas's investment philosophy. He wasn't just looking for entrepreneurs who wanted to make money. He was looking for entrepreneurs who wanted to solve problems that other people considered intractable. The financial returns followed from the social impact, not the other way around. That evening, Thomas and Warren had dinner at a quiet restaurant in San Francisco, where they could process what they had seen and plan their collaborative initiatives. Without interruption, I'm beginning to understand why your investment returns have been so strong, Warren said as they settled into their meal. You're not just investing in good businesses, you're investing in business models that create value by solving previously unsolved problems. Exactly, and that's why I think our educational initiatives can be so powerful. We're not just trying to help individual students, we're trying to solve the problem of wasted human potential on a systematic basis. Warren nodded, pulling out his legal pad to review the notes he'd been making throughout the day. I've been thinking about how to structure the Rural Excellence Initiative to maximize both individual impact and systemic change. What if we created regional centers in small cities across the Midwest, each one serving as a hub for identifying and supporting promising students within a 100-mile radius? Thomas considered the idea carefully. That's brilliant. Instead of trying to manage everything centrally, you'd have local programs that understand the specific challenges and opportunities in their regions. And those regional centers could eventually become self-sustaining as their alumni begin contributing back to the program. Right. And we could connect the regional centers to each other, creating a network that shares best practices and creates opportunities for students from different areas to learn from each other. They spent the next 2 hours developing the concept in detail, sketching out organizational structures, funding mechanisms, and success metrics. By the time they finished dinner, they had outlined a program that could potentially serve thousands of students across multiple states, while maintaining the personal touch that made Thomas's Columbia Fellowship so effective. Warren Thomas said as they prepared to leave the restaurant. "I have to tell you that working on this with you feels like the culmination of something that started 60 years ago in Graham's classroom. We're taking the principles we learned about creating value and applying them to the most important investment of all, investing in people." "I feel the same way," Warren replied. "And I think we're proving that the best partnerships are built on shared values rather than shared interests. Our interests have diverged over the decades, but our values have remained aligned." The next morning, Thomas took Warren to visit one more company, a social enterprise that provided job training and placement services for formerly incarcerated individuals. The founder was a former investment banker who had left Wall Street after her brother was imprisoned, and she witnessed firsthand how difficult it was for people with criminal records to find employment. "The recidivism rate in this country is about 68%, the founder explained. "But for people who find stable employment within 6 months of release, the rate drops to less than 20%. The problem isn't that formerly incarcerated people can't work, it's that they can't get hired." Her company had developed a comprehensive program that combined skills training, job placement, and ongoing support for both employees and employers. The business model was sustainable because it charged fees to companies for successful placements, while providing all services to participants free of charge. "What's your success rate?" Warren asked. "Over 80% of our participants find stable employment within 3 months of completing the program, and over 90% of those are still employed after 1 year. We're not just changing individual lives, we're demonstrating that this population represents an untapped source of reliable, motivated workers." Warren was deeply moved by what he saw at the company, formerly incarcerated individuals learning new skills, gaining confidence, and building relationships that would support their long-term success. But he was also impressed by the business discipline that made the program sustainable and scalable. "This is the same principle we're applying to the Rural Excellence Initiative," he said to Thomas as they left the facility. "We're identifying a population with unrealized potential, providing them with the support they need to succeed, and creating systemic change by demonstrating what's possible. And like all good investments," Thomas added, "the returns compound over time. Every person who succeeds through these programs becomes capable of helping others succeed, creating multiplier effects that extend far beyond the original investment." As Warren's visit to California drew to a close, he and Thomas spent their final afternoon working on a formal proposal for the Rural Excellence Initiative. They outlined a 5-year pilot program that would establish regional centers in 6 small cities across the Midwest, each serving approximately 50 students per year. The program would identify promising high school juniors through partnerships with local schools, community organizations, and business leaders. Selected students would receive mentorship, academic support, and leadership development during their senior year of high school, followed by full college scholarships and ongoing guidance throughout their undergraduate years. But like the Mitchell Fellowship Program, the Rural Excellence Initiative would be about more than individual achievement. Alumni would be expected to contribute to their home communities, either by returning to work in small towns or by using their positions in larger cities to create opportunities for other rural students. "I think we should announce both programs simultaneously," Thomas suggested as they finalized their planning. The Mitchell Fellowship addressing barriers within elite institutions, and the Rural Excellence Initiative addressing barriers to accessing those institutions in the first place. Together, they represent a comprehensive approach to expanding opportunity. "I like that," Warren agreed, "and I think we should make the announcement at next year's Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting. It will be a way of demonstrating that business success and social responsibility aren't separate endeavors. They're different aspects of the same commitment to creating value. As Warren prepared to return to Nebraska, he reflected on how much his understanding of philanthropy and partnership had evolved over the past month. His friendship with Thomas had resumed as if 60 years hadn't passed, but it had also deepened in ways that wouldn't have been possible when they were young men focused primarily on their own advancement. "Thomas," he said, as they shook hands, "at the airport, I want you to know that reconnecting with you has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. Not just because of what we're building together, but because of what you've taught me about the long-term impact of seemingly small actions." "The feeling is mutual," Thomas replied, "and I think we're just getting started. These programs will outlive both of us, and they'll touch lives in ways we can't even imagine." 6 months later, Warren stood before 20,000 shareholders. At the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting in Omaha, Thomas sat in the front row, along with Dr. Chen from Columbia and several high school principals from small towns across the Midwest. The shareholders had come to hear about investment performance and business strategy, but Warren had something different in mind. "Before we discuss Berkshire's financial results," Warren began, "I want to talk about a different kind of investment. One that doesn't appear on our balance sheet, but represents the most important work I'm doing at this stage of my life." He told the story of receiving Thomas's letter, of their reunion at Columbia, and of the collaborative programs they were launching. He spoke about the interconnection between business success and social responsibility, about the compound returns of investing in human potential, and about the obligation of successful people to expand opportunity for others. Thomas Mitchell and I learned about value investing in the same classroom 60 years ago, Warren concluded. Today, we're applying those same principles to a different kind of value creation, helping young people from small towns and underserved communities realize their full potential. We believe this represents the highest and best use of the resources we've been fortunate enough to accumulate. The audience erupted in applause, but Warren wasn't finished. "I want to close with something Thomas taught me during our recent reunion. He reminded me that none of us succeeds in isolation. Every achievement builds on support, encouragement, and opportunities that others provided, often without expecting recognition or return. The Mitchell Fellowship Program and the Rural Excellence Initiative are our attempt to systematize that kind of support, to ensure that talent and determination are rewarded regardless of economic circumstances or social connections." As Warren stepped away from the podium, he caught Thomas's eye and saw in his old classmate's expression the same satisfaction he felt himself. They had completed a circle that began in Professor Graham's classroom, but they had also started a new cycle that would continue long after they were gone. The programs they had created would touch thousands of lives over the coming decades. But more importantly, they would demonstrate that the principles of value investing, patience, discipline, long-term thinking, and focus on fundamental worth could be applied to human potential as effectively as they could be applied to financial markets. Years later, when Warren looked back on his long career, he would remember the day he received Thomas's letter as a turning point, not because it led to financial gains or business opportunities, but because it reminded him that the most valuable investments are often the ones that can't be measured in dollars. Investments in relationships, in principles, and in the boundless potential of human beings who simply need someone to believe in them. In the end, both men understood that their true legacy wouldn't be found in their investment returns or their accumulated wealth, but in the countless young people who would have opportunities they might never have had otherwise. And perhaps most importantly, those young people would carry forward the lesson that success is not just about what you achieve for yourself, but about what you make possible for others. The story of Warren Buffett and Thomas Mitchell became a quiet legend in the investment community, not because of the money involved, but because of the reminder it provided that the greatest returns come from investments in human potential, kindness, and the patient work of creating opportunities for others to flourish. As Warren often said in his later years, compound interest is powerful, but compound compassion is transformational. And in classrooms across the Midwest, young people who had never imagined attending elite universities were discovering that their dreams were not only possible, but welcomed, a testament to the enduring impact of two men who remembered what it felt like to be young, ambitious, and in need of someone who believed in their potential. If this story reminded you that quiet persistence often speaks louder than criticism, like this video and subscribe to Panorama Legacy. Each click helps us share stories that grow not from pride, but from patience. Let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what part of his journey stayed with you the longest? And if you're ready for another story, one where dignity answers doubt and quiet vision rewrites the past, click on the next video on your screen. Because sometimes success doesn't shout, it simply returns and opens the same door it was once locked out of.